The line stretched for 3 blocks before the station even opened. It was May 1979, somewhere outside Los Angeles, and a man named Gerald had been sitting in his car since 5 in the morning. He had a full tank. He wasn't running low, but he'd heard a rumor the previous evening that the station down the street might run dry by noon, and something about that rumor, half-heard, unverified, passed between neighbors over a fence, made him get up before sunrise and join the queue anyway. Gerald wasn't panicking. He was being careful. That's what made it so strange. Because if you multiplied Gerald by 10 million, across California, across the country, across every industrial economy on the planet, that quiet, careful decision to act on a rumor, you got a crisis that nobody in power had predicted, triggered by a disruption that never fully happened. Iran's oil workers had gone on strike in late 1978. The Shah was losing control. By January 1979, Iranian crude production had fallen by nearly 5 million barrels per day, roughly 7% of what the world was consuming at that moment. 7%. Not a third, not half, 7. Other producers scrambled to make up the gap. Saudi Arabia pumped harder. The shortfall that actually reached the market was closer to 4 or 5%. And yet oil prices doubled in 12 months. They went from $13 a barrel to $34. Inflation in the United States climbed past 13%. Unemployment rose. The Carter presidency collapsed under the weight of it. Detroit started losing the car market to Japan for the first time in history. All of that from 7%. From a revolution that never closed a single shipping lane, never mined a single harbor, never fired a single shot at a tanker. That is the first thing you need to understand about the Strait of Hormuz. The physical act of closing it is almost beside the point. The strait itself is a corridor of water sitting at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, squeezed between the southern coast of Iran to the north and Oman and the UAE to the south. At its narrowest, it is 21 miles wide. Through those 21 miles run 2 shipping lanes, each just 2 miles across. One for vessels heading out, one for vessels heading in. That is the entire exit from the Persian Gulf. There is no other way out by sea. Every barrel of oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, every tanker carrying Qatari liquefied natural gas to Japan or South Korea has to pass through those 2 narrow lanes. In 2024, roughly 20 million barrels of oil moved through the strait every single day. 1 in every 5 barrels consumed anywhere on Earth. Now here is what most people get wrong when they think about Hormuz. They imagine a door. They imagine Iran closing the door, the oil stopping, the world running out of fuel. That is not how it works. The door doesn't need to close. It only needs to look like it might, because what drives an oil crisis is not the physical shortage. It is the anticipation of a physical shortage. Gerald, sitting in his car at 5 in the morning, understood this better than he knew. What he was responding to was not an empty tank. It was a feeling, shared by millions of people simultaneously, that the system might not work tomorrow the way it worked today. And when enough people respond to that feeling at the same time, they create the very shortage they were afraid of. The hoarding becomes the crisis. The fear becomes the fact. This is what happened in 1979. Oil buyers around the world didn't wait to see how bad the Iranian disruption would get. They bought ahead. They built inventories. They contracted for more crude than they needed because they were afraid that if they waited, the price would be higher and the supply smaller. Their collective caution pulled oil off the market faster than the Iranian strike had removed it. The Federal Reserve's own historical records from that period noted plainly that the anticipation of shortage, not the shortage itself, was the primary driver of the price spike. 7% became a doubling because fear is a multiplier. Iran understood this, not immediately, not as a deliberate strategy in 1979. That revolution was chaos, not calculation. But the lesson it taught was absorbed, slowly, over the following decade, by the men who would come to control the Islamic Republic's foreign policy. You don't need to stop the oil. You only need to make the world believe you might. And here is where the geography of Hormuz becomes genuinely terrifying when you understand it properly. Iran shares the northern coastline of the strait for its entire length. Its territory wraps around the passage like a hand around a throat. It controls the islands, Greater Tunb, Lesser Tunb, Abu Musa, that sit directly in the shipping lanes. Its Revolutionary Guard Corps maintains fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, and coastal artillery along hundreds of miles of shoreline. A 2002 U.S. military war game, the Millennium Challenge, simulated an attempt by a Hormuz-controlling power to use swarms of small boats, mines, and shore-based missiles against a superior naval force. The simulated Iranian side won so decisively that the Pentagon reportedly reset the exercise and changed the assumptions. The results were too embarrassing to publish in full. All of this means that Iran does not need to physically block Hormuz to cause a crisis. It only needs to demonstrate that it could. An attack on a tanker raises insurance rates. Rising insurance rates make shipping companies hesitate. Hesitating shipping companies slow the flow of oil. Slowing oil flow tightens the market. A tightening market spikes prices. Spiking prices hit every economy on Earth through fuel costs, fertilizer prices, freight rates, food inflation. And the physical damage, one tanker, one mine, one speedboat attack, might represent a fraction of a percent of global supply. The mechanism that turns that fraction into a global shock is not physics, it is psychology. This is the pattern that has repeated itself with remarkable consistency across every major Iran-Hormuz confrontation of the last 45 years. In 2008, Iran threatened to close the strait if Western sanctions tightened. It did not close it. Oil spiked anyway. In 2012, the European Union announced a full embargo on Iranian oil. But Iran threatened again. Carrier groups sailed through in defiance. Iran backed down, but oil had already moved 4 to 6% on the threat alone, before a single additional barrel was taken off the market. In 2019, the Revolutionary Guard began seizing tankers in the Gulf, British vessels, South Korean vessels, others. The strait remained open. War risk insurance premiums tripled on certain routes. Shipping companies began rerouting. The signal had been sent without the door ever closing. Each time, the world collectively exhaled when the worst didn't happen. Each time, analysts noted that Iran had more to lose than to gain from a full closure. They needed the oil revenue themselves. They needed the strait open to export their own production. That logic was sound. It held for decades. It became the consensus. And consensus, us in finance and in geopolitics alike, is the thing that makes the next surprise so much more destructive. Because the consensus was built on a specific assumption, that Iran's rational self-interest would always be the governor on the escalation, that the men making decisions in Tehran would always calculate what a full closure would cost Iran before they pulled the trigger. And for 45 years, they did. The threat was the weapon. The actual closure remained theoretical. Then, on February 28, 2026, something changed that the consensus had not accounted for. The man who had held ultimate authority over Iranian foreign policy since 1989, who had made every calculation about when to threaten and when to retreat, was killed in an airstrike on Tehran. Ali Khamenei was gone. The self-limiting factor that analysts had relied upon for a generation, the supreme leader's cold calculation of Iran's interests, was replaced overnight by a succession crisis, a regime fighting for survival, and a new acting leader with no reason to honor the old restraint. By March 2nd, Iran had formally declared the strait closed. Not threatened, closed. Brent crude crossed $100 a barrel before a single additional tanker was physically stopped. It reached $126 within days. The IEA called it the greatest energy supply disruption since the 1970s. The Dow fell 400 points in a session. The European Central Bank postponed planned rate cuts. Fertilizer prices rose 50%. Maersk suspended Middle East routes. The war risk insurance became effectively unavailable for some passages at any price. None of that required the strait to be physically impassable. Some ships were still moving. Some lanes were partially open. The door was not fully shut. It only looked like it might be, permanently, this time under entirely new political conditions. And that was enough. Gerald, sitting in his car outside Los Angeles in 1979, had understood something that took economists years to formally model. That a shortage you believe is coming is already a shortage. That the anticipation of disruption to a system people depend on is itself a form of disruption. That when the system in question moves 20% of the world's oil through a corridor 21 miles wide, the psychology of 7 million tanker watchers, insurance underwriters, shipping executives, and futures traders is as powerful a force as any mine in the water. The Strait of Hormuz has never fully closed in modern history. Not in 1979, not in 1984, not in 2012. Not yet, but the price of its potential closure has been paid, in full, many times over. In inflation, in recessions, in lost savings, in careers derailed, in families that planned for one future and got another. The door doesn't need to close. It only needs to creak. In the next episode, we go inside the years when that creaking became something much louder. The tanker war of 1980 to 1988, when Iran and Iraq turned the Persian Gulf into a battlefield. And the world discovered exactly how close to the edge this waterway could take everyone. All that if this pattern of history feels relevant to what you're watching unfold right now, share this with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.